G'day everyone. Welcome back to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez welcoming you back. And as always, thank you for supporting the podcast. And as I've said in many of these recordings, I hope everyone is doing okay around Australia as it relates to COVID-19. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully we'll get there sooner rather than later. So I hope everyone is doing okay. By way of introduction, today's podcast guest is the principal of RYP International and is the chairman of My Word. Can I welcome to the podcast, David Stewart? How are you, mate?
Good, Eric. How are you?
Thank you for your time today. So what is it about leadership that inspired you to work in this area?
Cut a long story short, if I wind the video back, I initially started life studying physical education. And what I specialised in, it was what motivated teams, what motivated individuals. Because I always found physiologically and from a skill acquisition piece, high-performance teams are at the same level. So the difference between those that excel and those that don't come down to culture, and often the key thing around culture is leadership. So I got involved in it, specialised in sports science, and then spent some time with elite sporting teams around the world. And then since 1984, I've been working with organisations, helping organisations apply their strategic intentions, their brand promises, and their culture. The difference between achieving a strategic plan and a brand intention is quite simply one thing: culture. And what drives culture? Leadership. This will
open up the discussion quite a bit. So for the purposes of what we're discussing here, what's David Stewart's definition of leadership?
Quite simple. Leadership is making a difference. So often leadership and management get confused. Leadership's about change, management's about performance. And so leadership is not a part-time work habit, it's a full-time life quest. And so if you start looking at the attributes of leadership and you then put in the parentheses of parent, manager, friend, mentor, coach, supporter, supervisor, they're all leadership pieces. And so leadership is a life skill, so much a set of competency theories.
Let me ask you a question, because you've piqued my interest on something here. You drew together leadership and culture. Where do you see the connect happens? And from your experience working with organizations, where does the disconnect happen? Is it that cultures in some organizations are just dysfunctional because there's never been a proper organizational culture, or is it from the top leadership, or is it a combination of things?
People overcomplicate culture. There's a few things. The moment you leave culture to HR is when you're going to fail. So culture is a leadership thing, and culture, simply unpacked, is the way you do things. And so culture then forms in terms of behaviours, symbols, and systems. So how you act and behave and what you tolerate symbolises what you reward and recognise and ignore. And then systems is then the way you actually then formally and informally coach and drive your team, the disciplines that hold it all together. And so when you start looking at culture, quite simply, the research is quite clear. Culture precedes performance every time. And so when you're driving sustained and systematic performance over long periods of time, it's always around culture and human interactions and mindsets and behaviours. And so that is what your team are doing. And quite frankly, teams only perform best when they're confident. If you're not feeling confident, they're not going to perform at their peak. But then what drives confidence is the things around commitment, competencies, empowerment, and creating that right environment for excellence to occur. And that is a leadership's responsibility. That is a leader's responsibility, creating the right environment for success to occur.
Is it fair to say that when you're trying to build a leadership mindset into a culture, so let's think of a medium-sized corporate, is the definition of culture coming from that individual, or do all leaders need to represent what the culture is and what you're willing to accept as an organization?
Yeah, good question. So if you start to unpack this more when people actually start to then, how do you measure culture in an organisation, ultimately comes back down to the lived experience. So the lived experience of customers and the lived experience of staff. And so when you start to then look at the things like leadership, am I empowering my staff to be situational leaders, to then make decisions, make good judgment, and have informed mindsets and behaviours? Or am I driving a top-down leadership position, which means drives a bureaucratic or compliant culture? So when people actually then see a problem, rather than solve it, they report it. So it starts to drive this notion of who owns moments of truth as they arise in organisations. A moment of truth is a problem or an issue or something that starts to go into that. And so this forms part of the type of culture you're wanting to lead. And so there are only 5 types of organisational cultures to drive. You're either having an achievement culture, a process culture, a customer-centric culture, an innovation culture, or a culture that focuses on process. So what is it that you're trying to drive? And a macro culture has micro cultures. And so within a large or medium-sized organisation, the type of culture you're wanting with a sales team may be quite different from the type of culture you're trying to drive with an operations or a shared service team. But ultimately, that we all share the same values and the same brand commitments. So we're all on the same page in terms of the behaviours of those things. It's just how we go about doing it. And that forms situational leadership. So how do the situational leaders act and behave in a particular circumstance around that? And that's where you start to see the cascading up and down of leadership.
I've titled the next theme, The Lonely Road of Leadership. Is it as lonely as you make it, or is it a part of the leadership process that at times it's ultimately up to a person to make a decision?
It's both, really, isn't it? You know, when you sit down and you're thinking, okay, well, what's the right decision for my child and school to go to? That's quite a lonely and thinking around that. But you actually then discuss and validate that with other friends and colleagues and others, and it starts to affirm that. And so ultimately leadership, yes, you have to be accountable for the decisions that you make. And so, yes, that is lonely. But also you need to validate and share and do that in your teams and colleagues, formal and informal teams. And that gives you the confidence that you're making some of the right decisions around that. And so leadership is in everything you do in terms of self-leadership, in terms of how do I actually make sure that I'm balancing my life the right way between my career and my personal life around that versus the influence and impact I'm having on my community versus what I'm doing with my work colleagues.
The next topic area, and this is one, I think you've alluded to this a little bit in a foundational sense, but let me ask you this. Measuring success. Now, before you answer, when I use this theme, I'm not looking necessarily at KPIs.
Sitting there thinking around how you measure success is all about outcomes. So if I'm driving the success, and certainly KPIs aren't necessarily the right measures of success, it's saying, okay, are your staff capable, confident and committed to the organisation and making decisions? And are we actually growing? Versus if I'm a principal, are Year 12s rolling off the production line, confident, capable and resilient, and do they get into their first preference rather than what score they got for their VCE, those things. So success is all about building a state of mind and a set of outcomes that link to your vision of what is it you're trying to achieve around that. So for me, I'm always interested in linking the success of where they are in the journey of good, better, best around that to say, okay, are we trending the right way? Are you seeing the right things? And then how do you deal with exceptions? Success needs to be quite clear, and ultimately there's aspirations that you're looking for. So, you know, like you, I want my children to be resilient, happy, and enthusiastic for life. How do I measure that? Just the state of mind, happiness. At the same time, I want them comfortable and owning their own home. So how do I measure that? Well, have they got a house and they're paying it off? So it's there, and it comes back down to, you know, some of the philosophies that you put into life is that you know, life's all about living in the moment and achieving those things. It's not about possessions, and it's not about you know, how much you earn. It's all about whether you're making a difference and are you leaving a legacy. And all leaders leave a legacy, and it's defined by others.
That's an amazing point, and you're probably one of the first ones to bring this up. So congratulations to you, and thank you for sharing this. But this thing about legacy and the role of leaders, I want to just unpack this a little bit, because I hadn't given this a lot of thought when I think about this topic a fair bit. I talk about this topic a fair bit. But I'd never thought about, I've been doing some recent podcasts around storytelling and leadership. And I think one of the parts of a good story is what's the ending, and is there more to come? Is the ending of a story really the beginning of something else? And I think that's where this idea of legacy fits in nicely. And you've obviously been in the world of work for a little while. I have. And so I'll ask you this as a veteran in this space, so to speak. Do you believe people give that idea of what their legacy is going to be as a leader in any capacity much thought?
It's a good question, because, you know, we're all taught from early age, follow your passion and follow your things. We go through different life phases. And so for me, there's important things around personal leadership you need to go. So the first 20 odd years of your life, you're discovering what you are. And then so in your early 20s, it's a really important piece to then go and explore what you are. And this is a piece where there's some things tick a box and say, yeah, that's what I really like doing. Or other things where you go down a dead end and say, that's not what I do. And that's okay. But in your early to mid to late 20s, it's a really important process for people to go from a self-leadership piece to go and explore what they are. And then you then start to move into this notion of applying what you are. And when you start to apply what you are, the first thing I learned in leadership was everyone has a front yard and a backyard. The front yard's your career and what you see, and the backyard's the main game, what makes you happy and fulfilled. And if you actually start with a notion in your mid-30s about saying, okay, a fulfilled life is a successful life based on your terms. So when we start going into leadership, what is it leader and what types of things? And so leadership's not a title. Being CEO or MD or something, those things, that's not leadership, that's a title. When you start going into leadership, it's the impact that you've made on yourself and how you've been able to impact on others. Your first duty in life is to yourself. And if you can then be right yourself, then you can help others. So this piece where you start to apply what you are is a balance between your front yard and backyard. Yes, I'm an entrepreneur and a career and I have my own business, but I'm also a father and a husband. So I've got to put balance into those things. Success at the expense of your health or your family is failure in my book. And so being able to role model that. And then at some point you click over in terms of later in life, and whether that's 45, 55, 65 in the pursuit of contentment and making a difference. And you think all the way along, in some way, shape or form, you've impacted others, and rightly or wrongly, or supporting others, that's what it is. And it's that self-awareness piece and that self-leadership piece is mission critical to them being seen as a trusted and respected leader by others.
Things in a life can change that, particularly when you're talking about, do you have your backyard sorted out and your support's there, and are you giving the time to those things that invigorate you, make you more resilient? All those non-work, non-career things that establish you as a healthy, hopefully well-adjusted human being to move forward. Because I have to agree that if you're not right in your own headspace, physically, mentally, and in relationships, then you're not going to be of much use to other people. Because the way I've defined leadership for me is about being of service to others. And I think you've given me something to think about there, particularly if it's about building capabilities in other people, because at some point you've done as much as you're going to do. And I think a legacy, if we're going to go back to using that terminology, is how can you help others build their career basis? Not necessarily by saying, do what I do and you'll be successful. It's more, here's what I've learned. I'm prepared to share that.
One of the most humbling experiences we have in our business is putting on my word hat, where we actually capture life stories of elders. And the one thing we've learned is as you age, the one thing that starts to creep into you is wisdom. You get life experiences. And when you start talking to some of these people in their 70s, 80s and 90s, you get this wonderful wisdom coming out that they shrug their shoulders as just being something that they don't think is important. But it's really important when you actually start to look into that. And so picking up wisdom is really important. But in order to get wisdom, you don't listen to it. You actually have to go and experience it. And so you've actually got to get out there and have a go at things and do things and stuff things up and learn from all that. People have been absolutely, besotted with the fact that I've gone and done this leadership course. Just because you've done a course doesn't make you a leader. It's giving you extra skills, but you still have to go and apply them and do those things. And so some of the most effective leaders have been people that have just been so humble and doing things, but they've been impactful on those things. And so leadership is all about how you coach, influence, support, and guide others as best you can, but also enable them to actually have a go and learn their own wisdom for that. And so it's building that process. And so that's why I always say leadership's is a never-ending life quest. It's in life skill. It's not a part-time work habit. And I think at the centre of all those things is your ability to actually author and tell your story, because you're the one in charge of your life and your legacy. So how you author your story and tell your story is a really important part of how you view the world.
Let's move on to leader capabilities. Now, I particularly am interested in this area of the discussion because I think there's value in trying to tease out what are those skills, those knowledge areas that you need to be as effective and capable a leader as you can possibly be. So again, drawing on your experience, what are those capabilities for you?
Yeah. I sort of start with leadership comes from within. within this first step to say, okay, so what is it you're trying to achieve? What are you trying to influence? And roll the video forward 3 or 5 years. What would good look like? And so that's a really important narrative to hear, because that's an important part of what is it you've got passion and what you want to lead. The second then starts to then build around, okay, the capabilities of a leader is then, and again, all leadership styles work. There are no one best. Just choose one. They all work. But how do you then go about coaching and influencing others? How do you go about then building confidence and capability in others? And how do you start putting inspiration into others as well, so they're aspiring to be good themselves? And they're the leadership capabilities that start to go into that. And we all have our own different ways, and it's the same way of asking, what are the best parenting skill sets? There's a bit of persistence, there's a bit of a reminder, there's a bit of discipline, there's a bit of fun, and those things that go into those things. But the same skill sets of what you're trying to do and influence kids is what you're trying to do and influence with others, formally and informing as a leader. I do know 2 things. If you lose your trust or respect as a leader, you never get it back. It's all about building your integrity as a leader around those things. So following through on promises that you make, holding commitments around those things, holding people to account, helping solve problems, but making sure that they're solving the problem and you're giving them the support and empowerment to do that. Empowerment is an often used word, but it requires leadership facilitation, not delegation. And so how do you empower people around the process? And this is the classic adaptive leadership, to say, okay, when do I need to coach? When do I need to support? When do I need to be dictatorial? When do I need to be laissez-faire? It all depends on the person's confidence, commitment, and competency. And that's classic adaptive leadership style that you're using around the different people that you're coaching, based on your observations on how a person's capable, confident, competent, and committed, is then tells you how much permission you're going to give them. That's a really classic adaptive leadership. We all do it different styles, and it's the same thing that you do as a parent around those things in terms of trusting and supporting and building the skill sets, capability, and confidence of your kids.
David, let me take you to the question I ask in all the podcasts, the nature versus nurture question. Are leaders born or are they made?
I'd say born from the initial part, because part of that is growing up in a nurturing environment that allows you then to be the best version of yourself, and then it then moves into the nurture piece. When you start then saying, okay, well, have you actually got what it takes? How do you do? What's a successful life for you? And if sitting on the end of a jetty catching fish and working part-time with little stress as possible is your definition of success, you're great. That comes back down to having a fulfilled life versus a successful life. And so it's building that fulfillment. But there is no question that your early years need to be an important part of creating that nurturing environment. And there's just as many people have come from a hard environment versus a good environment that they've gone on to do amazing things. And it just comes back down to having the commitment and inner confidence to have a fulfilled life.
Some of the podcasts that I've done have added other elements to the nature versus nurture questions. So, David, one of my former podcast guests, Mike House, suggested to me that there's probably 2 additional elements to that question about nature versus nurture. And one of them is you have to make a conscious decision at some point to be a leader. And the second element was leaders need to make a decision about whether or not they are, in essence, going to be lifelong learners. Do those 2 things resonate with you?
Whether you need to make a conscious decision to be a leader, ultimately that's for others to make. So leadership's not a title. And so if you've impacted others, you've been an effective leader. For me, it's your quest to make a difference. The other thing that you do need to make a thing is that have an evolving life, which means you keep learning. You keep discovering things. You keep having the thrill to actually live life and pursue that. And so I actually don't believe in the word retirement. We don't retire. Just be busy all your life. And so if you actually think who lives the longest on this planet are musicians and actors, and what year and what age do they retire? Never. And so having a purpose and making a difference is key. So I often say to people, don't retire, rewire, and keep learning and evolving, because you come into any aspect of life with a set of skills, wisdom, life experiences that you can value add to. That forms part of one of the books I've written is No Labels, Just Stories. And don't label people. It's just who they are and what they do and how they've made a difference. And that just keeps going on and on and on. I don't think you need to make a conscious decision to be a leader, because that assumes you're pursuing a title. But what you do need to make a conscious decision is to lead an evolving life and support and influence and impact with others. And you never know the impact you're making until someone tells you.
If you had the capacity to go back and have a chat with a younger version of yourself, what would you tell a younger David Stewart about effective leadership? What would you say to a younger version of yourself about that?
One of the things that you learn as you get older is more empathy, and to actually don't be so quick to judge. Really, listen to hear, look to see, because everyone has a front yard and backyard, and just because you're seeing a particular person in a particular moment, you've got no idea of the back history there. And so I think what I've learned is that piece of empathy and looking to listen, looking to see, and listening to hear is there. And so you actually spend a bit more time connecting with people rather than being as quick to judge or pigeonhole or categorize somebody and drop. That would be probably the biggest piece of advice I give myself around that, given what I know now.
David, thank you for your time. Before we go, what are you doing at the moment that the listeners need to know about, mate?
Well, two things. So my organisation, RYP, Reaching Your Pinnacle, is a consulting organisation, and we work globally. But the real thing that we're passionate about here is my work. We're actually empowering families to capture their loved ones' life stories so they live on forever. And so once you've captured their story, don't worry, you then got something to actually then pass on to future generations. That for me has been our love project, and it's just been amazing how, as people age, the 3 I's of aging, isolation, illness, and loss of independence, how well they age depends on how well they have a sense of self-belief, and anything you can do to help package that your story is amazing, and let's capture it. You've got something to pass on to future generations and live forever. My word, connect through stories is what we're really enjoying.
Again, I'll put a link to my word on there, as well as RYP International, mate. I'll make those links available, and to your LinkedIn profile, obviously. Thank you for your time, mate.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks again for your support. A lot more content on the way. Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you all on the next podcast.